Welcome back to another episode of Steve and Friends. Tim Garrett joins us today. Tim is a professor at the Department of Atmospheric Sciences at the University of Utah. Thanks for tuning in. Enjoy the show.
Hi, my name is Dan the Man. That's the new name tag for today, and we're looking for some audience feedback from all of you out there. Is it a yay or a nay, a thumbs up or a thumbs down for Dan the Man, or would you prefer Daniel Sanderson? That's all I want to tell you about me. The focus of this show is actually on Tim Garrett. He's my guest. I'm going to bring him on stage, and we're going to talk about nuclear fission. Okay, just briefly, I have a quick question for him about that. Then we're going to get into thermodynamics, okay, and how it's important for his research. Then we're going to bring Steve into the conversation and ease into the conversation of economics and the theory of everything. Okay, so with that, why don't we bring Tim onto the show? And Tim, how are you doing today?
Doing great. It's a beautiful day up here. I'm at my cabin and it's dumping fresh powder. So look for a little skiing later.
Yeah, you told me all about your cabin out in the woods in the break and before we launched the show. I'm envious and not so envious. Maybe not of the workload and the 10 feet of snow that you're surrounded by, but I think you alluded to it about the skiing. The skiing's good, isn't it, Tim?
Yeah, the skiing is, there's a certain smugness that comes with Utah, and I am definitely feeling that smugness. It's exceptional snow right now. It's like deep powder on top of a firm base. It's just fantastic. Perfect skiing.
Right. Well, I mean, this is a different kind of question. It's more of a general scientific question, and it's I'm trying to get your opinion on something, in particular, nuclear fission. And as a scientist who's not directly in that field of physics, I'm sure you have an opinion or two about the current state of nuclear fission, the possibility of nuclear fission as a reliable source of energy for humankind. What are your thoughts as we ease into this conversation?
Yeah, I'm not an expert in nuclear fission either. As an atmospheric scientist, fortunately, that's one process we don't think about too much, except so far as it happens in the sun. But thinking about how something like nuclear fission might change society, I would say it may not be a panacea, especially not an environmental one, because more energy, let's say it does pan out, will simply enable us to grow faster. And the faster we grow on a finite planet, necessarily the lesser will be of the environment from which we extract through things like mining, natural resources. And so there's a bit of a zero-sum game going on where our success is environment's loss, and nuclear fission may be, let's say, a clean energy in terms of carbon dioxide, but whatever helps us hurts the rest of the world.
Nicely framed. I really appreciated that. I hope the audience did as well. That was a very good explanation. Okay, well, I wanted to bring up maybe something a little bit more related to your expertise. I'm going to show you a screenshot of some intellectual figures from our past. And these you should recognize these in terms of the fathers of thermodynamics. And you may recognize one or all of them, but do any of them jump out at you as being relevant to your research?
Well, I can't actually see them on my tiny phone, but I will say that there are two figures of thermodynamics that are particularly important to the way I think about things. And they're less the, let's say, the older engineer thermodynamicists who are focused on, really trying to understand how they could get the maximum amount of work out of an engine that was powered by coal, because in the Industrial Revolution, that was really something rather important to figure out. But then you had people like Gibbs and Boltzmann, who really put thermodynamics on a solid foundation. And that's really the modern foundation with which we can start thinking about things in terms of the statistical properties of a system. And so when I think about thermodynamics, I often think about, well, there's the ideas that were introduced by, say, Clausius. Clausius was a big one about how entropy is produced by a system. But then there are also the statistical aspects that we might think about in terms of how energy is shared among the various components of a system. So these are very general ideas. Let's say I'm thinking about clouds, and I'm a cloud physicist. I might think about how the energy is available to a cloud. This is usually buoyant energy. Might get distributed among all the possible ways that a cloud can be a cloud. And some might get more than others. And things like rising motions, production of cloud droplets and precipitation. There are mixing processes for turbulence. A bunch of different ways that this energy can be shared. But I might also think about how that energy might be shared among, let's say, people within a society, and how this manifests and how people behave. One of the greatest atmospheric scientists of all time was Louis Fry Richardson. He was the grandfather of numerical weather prediction. Numerical weather prediction just being how we predict the weather today using computer models. He came up with this idea. But he was also a pacifist. And one thing he did was show that the frequency of wars and how deadly they were followed a very simple mathematical distribution. This is wonderful work. And he called these deadly quarrels, which I rather like this word. And what he showed was that there is a particular mathematical form, what you call a power law, that shows that whether you're looking at, as he looked at, Manchurian bandits, or wars over many years, Chicago gangs, a whole variety of systems, you might have a large number of small deadly quarrels and a very small number of large deadly quarrels in proportion, in a proportionate amount that follows something called a power law, which would be, if you know some little bit of mathematics, if you plot it on a log-log scale, it would be a straight line with a particular slope. And the nice thing about this is that slope for the frequency of deadly quarrels is the exact same slope I see in my research describing the sizes of clouds. So it's the exact same slope, plotted the same way, describe the sizes of clouds. They follow the same thing as wars, deadly quarrels. And then you might start to think, well, why is this? And I like to think that everything ties back to thermodynamics. That's my hammer for all nails. And I think it's a good choice of hammer. Why do we fight wars? Well, we fight wars because we are competing over natural resources, things like energy. And why are there clouds? Why are there clouds of different sizes? Well, these clouds are doing the same thing. They are competing, fighting a battle over buoyant energy. And so when I look at the universe, or like, well, any phenomenon, whether it's a social phenomenon or a natural phenomenon, I like to think about things within the context that people like Gibbs and Boltzmann looked at things, which was that there is a certain amount of energy to go around. You have a variety of ways of being within a system that has an amount of energy. They all have to share. And given that they all have to share, what you end up seeing mathematically is a particular way of sharing that is common to all systems. And you see this just throughout this natural world and the social world and human behaviors. So ultimately, I think I'm no different than anything else in the universe physically.
Yeah, the $1,000,000 question is going to be how do we share? But hold on to that. And in the meantime, I'm going to bring Steve on to the show, and I want everybody out there to have a look at Steve's Twitter handle, which is at Prof Steve Keen. Retweet, like, follow Steve on Twitter. And with that, Steve, welcome back, my friend.
Hi, good to see you, Tim. Too long. How are you? And I know exactly where you are, of course. I've walked over the fields which you're talking about skiing on, so I'm very envious. Can you hear?
Yeah.
You hear okay? Yeah, okay. Well, what's that? Am I the only one hearing a strange tapping noise, or are you all? It feels like somebody tapping with M&Ms.
I don't
is
know.
anybody else hearing it? Yeah, I guess.
I'll mute mine. I don't think it's mine.
Yeah, strange. It really sounded like somebody, like a tap or dropping.
It's a Ty. He's the god from above. I can watch.
Okay, Ty, turn your sound off if you can, please, mate, because it's disturbing. So yeah, Tim, good to see you.
Just give him a little bit of a pause. Just give him a little bit of pause, Steve, because I find just pause and wait because he gets the signal. It's just it must be the 10 feet of snow surrounding his cabin. So
it's time delay. Yeah.
Tim, how are you doing? This was coming from Steve.
Well, I heard him. Can you hear me?
Just we have time lags. I saw you complaining about bad internet coverage in your cabin about 2 weeks ago on Twitter. So it's the same story, as that you have a very tenuous internet connection. Yeah.
I don't know.
Okay, well, you know what I'm gonna maybe do here, rather than focus so much on the conversation between Tim and Steve, I'm actually going to throw out a few questions, and then we'll let the probability of the internet signal dictate who answers or who kind of speaks up. So the theme of my next question has to do with economics, and it's a field that both of you guys share. I'm going to get you guys to do a little bit of maybe outside of your comfort zone in terms of an economic theory of everything. Okay. And that statement, it's not really a statement. I mean, it is in itself. We say, is there such what is an economic theory of everything? Right. And that statement itself is pregnant with hubris and may even say no comment. But if we're imagining what that would look like, would it be some sort of mixture between agent-based modeling and the macro work that, say, for example, you and Steve are working on? And that's the question, right? That's how I'd like to lead into the conversation. Let me know your guys' thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
I can answer that.
Well, actually, you roll first, Tim.
Any theory of anything, I don't really care what it's about. needs to appeal first and foremost to the laws of thermodynamics, because we know, just ahead of time, these are general. There is stance in the universe that violates the laws of thermodynamics. That's period. I mean, that's just the way things are. So if you want to have a theory of anything about anything, that's the place to start. And I think, there are ways to go about this for describing economic systems. And I think, the work I've done partly with Steve has shown that there is a foundation on which you can place human systems. It may be very broad brush to start with, but that you can link human activities to basic thermodynamic laws in ways that are actually some real predictability for where we may be headed. And that the key ingredients to this are things like how much we have from the past, or inertia, and our current availability of energetic and material resources. I think that's the starting point. The starting point is not to look at people or modeling or something like that. Could include that later as long as it's consistent dynamic laws. But ultimately, the first point to start when looking at any problem addressing physical things in the universe is to think about larger scale thermodynamic constraints.
And if I can chip in after that introduction, that's where Tim and I first met, because I was seeing Tim's work on thermodynamics as applied to economics. And the first thing we did when we met, which is actually in my apartment in Amsterdam, where I am right now, is we put his basic model of breakdown into Minsky. So I'm going to take a risk here and see if I can actually successfully share my screen after the catastrophe last week when I tried to do the same from a very lousy internet connection in the UK. And this is what we put together. Tim, the relationship between global wealth and energy consumption and global GDP, which is I think the unique thing about your approach.
Yeah, that was from.
We have a.
Yeah, that was from a paper we.
I now can't hear anything, and I'm not moving. Fucking damn.
Okay. Well,
do we lose Steve there?
Oh, he's back in. So let's.
Something froze. I mean, I just disappeared. I tried to share my screen, and then I went solid, let alone not being able to see you two guys. So, are you coming through okay now or not?
Pretty good.
Okay. This is feeling like the Maxwell Smart Show, the cone of silence. Which 2 weeks in a row now we've had hassles with bloody internet connections, so very frustrating.
Yeah,
I'm going to bring up a solution after the show, but
good.
I think I've got a solution. So
be good to hear that. Okay.
Yeah, stay tuned. And
well, if I can just elaborate on what Tim's work is from the perspective of me trying to understand it, because I mean I respect the laws of thermodynamics. My own modeling, I think, is constrained within the laws of thermodynamics, but I don't apply the mathematics of thermodynamics in the same way that Tim does, and I don't have the knowledge by any stretch compared to his knowledge of thermodynamics. But what Tim fundamentally did was make an analogy of human society to growth in the natural environment, and he's often used the example of a child, and a child eats food for two reasons. One is to provide the energy for the life that day, but the other is to grow the system, which is the child. So most of the energy goes into growing the child, and a small amount goes into daily activities in that sense. And that's why the kids consume so much compared to adults who've slowed down on that particular process. So what he got was a relationship between global wealth and global energy consumption, which meant that GDP itself related not to energy, as I do in my own work, but the change in energy. And if I have time, I will shortly bring up and share the model we're talking about here. But that fundamentally contradicts many of the hopes that people have about if we can just reduce our load on the planet, we'll be able to live sustainably within it. And Tim argues that, in effect, the inertia of maintaining the overall production system we have is what a large part of energy goes towards maintaining. And that inertia means that even if we cut back on our consumption, which is effectively what the child does to burn energy on that particular day, we'll still have an enormous amount of energy needed to maintain the productive system. And that makes it impossible to have a sustainable society on the planet. Now, Tim, have I blown anything in your explanation there?
Yeah, I think that's great, Steve. I would just say that most of the energy goes towards simply maintaining the system. So if you're talking about a child, we might consume, child might consume, let's say, 2,000 calories per day, or kilocalories, whatever it is. But that the growth rate of that child is, let's say as an adult, you might put on a pound a year, and that pound is actually only 3,500 kilocalories. So you're not actually, when you're growing, not very much of the energy that you consume actually goes towards production of new body mass. Most of it goes towards sustaining that which was previously produced. All your accumulated past production that took you to your current size. And you must maintain that just to keep staying alive, as you put it, from day to day to day. But then if you do put on some weight, or a child puts, or you and I put on weight, as we tend to, that new weight needs to have sustenance. And so, general to the global economy, what I showed quantitatively was that there's a direct link here, which is that our current energy consumption is not tied to our current GDP. You can make a correlation there, but it is not a direct link in the sense that you take the ratio of our current energy consumption globally, GDP. That is a number that's actually changing. We are getting more GDP per unit of energy as time moves on. But if you look at our cumulative GDP, our cumulative production over all of history, just like that child growing to adulthood that demands more, with the cumulative production over all of history, adjusting for inflation, we arrive at a number that I call the wealth. And I gather that's not perhaps the best word for an economist to think of, but I called it wealth naively. That number, that cumulative number, or using mathematically the word integral over time, that has a fixed ratio to our current rate of global energy consumption. And that's sort of like a constant that we can hang our hat on, linking an economic quantity to a thermodynamic quantity. And then going forward, what that means is that anything we continue to do in terms of inflation-adjusted production is simply going to add to our energy consumption needs, and then hence, our destruction of the environment. We can't. It's incompatible to have economic production adjusting for inflation not only destroy the environment, but accelerate our destruction of the environment. That's kind of the grim conclusion from this. We can't have our cake and eat it too. Our success is their loss.
And because we're talking in terms of the second law of thermodynamics, our success is less than their loss. So when you measure growth in GDP, we're actually leaving out the more than the equivalent destruction of the environment that we perpetrate at the same time. And that's that blindness about thermodynamics, which is, I mean, it's just rife through economists. They have no understanding of the law, and they don't even know that they don't understand the law, which I find so frustrating. So I saw a recent paper by Rainer Kummel. You know, Rainer Kummel is one of the mathematicians who works with Bob Ayres on their particular approach. And he made a comment about how neoclassical economics contradicts the laws of thermodynamics. And I saw a couple of very dismissive comments from neoclassical. Oh, well, we just like that. Yeah. They haven't got an effing clue of what they think that is, and they do contradict the laws of thermodynamics with their approach. And as who was it who put that wonderful comment, Tim, about if you contradict the laws of thermodynamics, there's nothing to be said for you but to collapse in the deepest humiliation. I think that was
that was a famous astrophysicist.
The guy who empirically verified Einstein's general theory of relativity, and he said, you know, if you contradict that, there's nothing I can do, nothing for you to do but collapse in abject humiliation. But that is actually the state of economics today. So what Tim is trying to do, and what we're trying to do with Tim, is first of all make the sort of economics we do consistent with the laws of thermodynamics, and then model Tim's approach within that.
I have a question. As a layman, it sounds to me what you guys are describing, without falling into a discipline, is, and I know there's a category in economics of this, but it sounds to me that it's like biodiversity economics. It's realizing that the biodiversity of the planet is part of the whole system. And is that one of the rubs with neoclassical? Is they don't want to factor environmental.
They wouldn't know biodiversity if they were eaten by an anthill. Okay. And I'm using anthill as an example because there's a wonderful comment. I'm sure it's Larry Summers who said it in the survey that Nordhaus did of economists back in 1994. And he said, for my answer for this particular question, biodiversity is irrelevant. I don't care about ants except for drugs. So, okay. Yeah, very, very.
That there's, I think that there's actually a caveat that can be put here, and I think that's is interesting. Is that at some level, I don't think economically we do need to consider biodiversity to model the human system, and that's probably that, because of course we do ultimately, because we do live in the environment. But something interesting happened where we have become effectively decoupled from the environment because we consume a natural resource that is not available to the rest of the biosphere, and that is fossil fuels. So, you know, ants, of course, they can't, or trees, they can't mine oil from underground. And so we live in this kind of this bubble where we can maintain ourselves, survive, without as much, you know, thinking about the biodiversity of the planet. That's why it's suffering so much. We don't actually rely on it as much as we would without fossil fuels. Now, of course, it all catches up to us because we do need the environment ultimately. Of course, things like climate change, which are a byproduct of burning fossil fuels, will catch up with us in terrible ways. But we can sort of decouple ourselves from the environment to some extent until we can't. And then the byproducts of consumption through pollution and through environmental degradation are going to lead to a situation where it's going to be even hard for us to consume the fossil fuels that sustain us, because we will live in an environment that's ravaged, say, by, you know, storms or sea level rise or drought or whatever it is. We just will lack the health to be able to access resources that we require, setting aside the issue of their depletion.
I was going to search Terence Why. I haven't heard of Terence before, so I'm going to take a look if I can find details on his work. Yeah, I think in some ways, I actually think we're probably, even though I think we're going to face a huge energy crunch, because of the impact of fossil fuels on the environment. In some ways, we're lucky that's happening first, because if we actually had a biodiversity crisis, that would be it. There's no way that we can scale back our destruction of species after we've destroyed the species. The species that.
But I have to say, Steve, it's we seem to be in the biodiversity crisis with the X number of species going extinct and the coral reefs, and so it's the blindness is almost like.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're damaging biodiversity, but biodiversity isn't yet damaging us.
Right, that's the point.
Whereas we're damaging energy is damaging us. And if I had to choose my crises, first of all, to give a wake the fuck call to humanity, rather it be energy than biodiversity, because if we only wake up after we've just the biodiversity foundations of our capacity to the environment, we're history. That's it. We're gone. But if we destroy the energy, then it's feasible to some extent that if we go from being a giant adult to a tiny child in terms of the size of the infrastructure we live on, which is reversing the process Tim's talking about, rather than maintaining, we try to reduce the amount of the infrastructure we've developed over time. There's some possibility for survival. But I think I'm pretty much a doomer these days, but I think, Tim, you're worse than me, aren't you?
I don't know. I'm going to enjoy some later today and try to make the most of life while I can. But yes, I mean, ultimately, I think I don't like the word doomer, because the fact is that we need to accept that all systems go through periods of growth in order to exist, and then all systems ultimately collapse. And we're a system. We will collapse. I mean, that's inevitable. It's not a new phenomenon. It is something that has always been something that was bound to happen since the very beginnings of civilization and our history of fire. It was always going to end badly. So
look, I think that's the heart of the conversation with people who may be in the opposite camp to where we are. Okay. I think fundamentally they want to disagree with that. And I don't know on what basis, really. I mean, you're coming at this from a long-term, very scientific approach. Okay. Albeit not all scientists think in that way. I mean, there's plenty of optimism out there with with scientists in the scientific community. But what I am saying is that the opposite side would push back and say, yes, but animals just don't live that way. We don't live like, well, we're eventually, going to experience a supernova, right? I mean, I think it's the cognitive discounting that we do based off of something that happens in the future. We're all guilty of it, right? To some degree. I mean, that example of going into a group of Nobel laureates, having a conversation with them and telling them that they have to save for their taxes and or they have to save for retirement. I mean, actually that wouldn't really ring true. I would say like younger generation, because they have a lifetime to save for retirement. You come back a week later and they don't do it. Why is it? You can prove it's correct. We know it's going to happen, but the immediate next day kind of living life seems to take priority over that. And that's formed philosophically it's part of our freedoms now. And people will fight to the death for that. Do you see it that way, you guys?
Well, I think, again, coming back to physics, all optimizes in the present. You're trying to consume as much as possible within the present, within the constraints that are around you. Now, things like saving for retirement is clearly something we do, but that is, in a sense, a form of optimization. We are optimizing I don't know exactly what we're optimizing, sorry, perhaps I shouldn't say this, but it's just, we are optimizing something, perhaps our sense of well-being in the present, by saving for retirement. And that sense of well-being has come culturally from being informed people who have to save for retirement. So I think we are optimizing always in the present. The problem with things like climate change is that we do not have a cultural background of global climate change. And that's a very different thing. So perhaps we don't have the cultural background, we don't have the history that informs us currently, so that we will constrain ourselves now in the present in a way that will help us survive for a longer period of time. But again, ultimately, it all ends up with collapse. So whether it happens sooner or later, the end result's the same.
Breaking news: scientist now starts working for the oil companies. He says, "Hey, it's over anyways." That next and see. I mean, I don't know, to poke fun at it, but I mean, sometimes that helps. What I like about the way you explain that one, Tim, is that it seems like you really nicely isolated the behavior itself, and yeah, that was nicely done. Steve, what are your thoughts?
Muted. Okay. Can you see that? Again, I'm trying to share my screen once more. I think this might be an interesting graph for Tim to take a look at. Can you see? Yeah, it's fairly simple, but I'm just doing a few pieces on, the nonsense that neoclassicals do on global warming and carbon and so on. And I decided to get a long-term data series and fit an exponential to it for carbon dioxide levels. And it's incredibly simple work, obviously, Tim. But look at that fit. That is just ridiculous, because that's saying you can start from the amount of carbon dioxide on the planet in 1600 and extrapolate forward and be capturing today's change in carbon dioxide levels from one year to the next ridiculously precisely. That's the extent to which we're basically being just like another any other biological creature on the planet, only we're exploiting an energy source the rest can't access, as you said. And we're just exploiting it, and it's growing exponentially, and that can't continue forever. And at some point, we're going to come crashing down because of the impact that on the planet. So yeah, we're headed for breakdown. And you can see that the curve and the obvious start where even a moron will see that it's exponential is 1980, and that's when we've been trying to control the 1990 on, and we've done bugger all. We might as well have. COP27, COP28, blah, blah, blah. Total waste of time. We've just continued on a trend you can track right back to the 1600s.
Yeah, I mean, the way I like to think of it is that we will consume as much as possible, as much as we can, until we can't.
Yep.
And that can't part will happen for one of two reasons. Either the resources that enable us to, as Steve is showing, start to become scarce, or there are what economists call externalities that impose challenges to civilization in one way or another. But, climate change is going to be one of them, and all the consequent damages from that make it difficult for us to access resources because we're being simultaneously destroyed. I like to think about it as being not perhaps a single event, but rather a death by 1,000 cuts.
Yeah.
If we have small cuts, as is going on perhaps right now, these are painful, but we can recover from them based on the resource access that we have. As these cuts become more frequent and they accumulate, eventually we will hit a point where we no longer have the resources to repair those cuts. And those cuts continue to happen and continue to accumulate. And at that point, we will switch from a point of explosive growth to stagnation. And then perhaps dynamically at that point of stagnation, that tap, tap, tap will eventually push us over into a phase of accelerating decline. And that may be quite fast at that point.
Yeah. The Seneca curve, as it's called.
Mm-hmm.
Tim, I'm going to push you on something here, if you don't mind. And that is, ages ago, I thought I understood why carbon dioxide captures infrared, or captures ultraviolet, emits infrared. I had an explanation based on the idea of quantum states of molecules and pushing a electron up to a higher state and then back down again. And you started giving an explanation which was completely wrong. It was actually about the frequency of vibration, I think it was, of the carbon dioxide atom, the molecule. So can you do us all? I'll stop sharing my screen now. I think I've made the point there properly. What amount of CO2? We'll come back to that one, Greg. We've asked some very interesting questions, but we might not have got a chance to answer them here. We might have to come back at a later case. But Tim, could you let the novices, and I'm one of them, understand why carbon dioxide captures radiation and retransmits heat? What's the actual mechanism? Don't spare us.
To be fair, it is somewhat challenging. Understand all these things. I mean, the greenhouse effect is actually a fairly complicated thing to understand, but the basic idea is just simply that there is a carbon dioxide, and carbon dioxide, because it has bonds between the carbon and the oxygen, is kind of squishy as a soft molecule, and because it's a fairly soft molecule, so, I mean, these are terrible terms of quantum mechanics, but it's not a rigid molecule with a triple bond like nitrogen, which is not a greenhouse gas. Nitrogen gas just doesn't absorb thermal radiation emitted by the planet because it's too stiff. Carbon dioxide can, and it has various ways of absorbing the radiation. And the one of them is that it bends. So if you can think about carbon dioxide being a linear molecule with carbon in the middle and oxygen on either side, then what happens is that it does this vibration, which is a bending. And simultaneously, because that introduces a dipole moment, introduces physics, does some rotation as well. But the ultimate thing is that it can absorb radiation, and it absorbs radiation at a frequency that the Earth emits a lot of radiation at. So it's tuned to absorb this radiant planet, and then when it absorbs that radiation, to maintain a constant to re-emit that radiation. And so it re-emits that radiation both to outer space and back down to the Earth. Earth's surface increases the Earth's temperature, surface temperature. And then to a second process, which is that because if the temperature rises, then because we have oceans, the concentration of water vapor in the air, because there's a source of water from the oceans, goes up. The higher temperatures, we can take more water vapor in the air. And the water vapor is also a squishy molecule, single bonds. Now, H2O, is like the oxygen in the middle, is a very, very, very squishy molecule. And water vapor is super, super squishy. So it can absorb thermal radiation from the planet at an incredibly wide range of frequencies. And so it's almost like carbon dioxide is the trigger on the gun, but the water vapor is really the bullet. That's the thing that does most of the greenhouse gas effect. But the trigger, you still need the trigger. And the trigger is the carbon dioxide. So it is starting to look like really the dial that controls the Earth's climate. It really just comes down to the carbon dioxide level. And that's something that can fluctuate quite a bit due to the biosphere doing whatever the biosphere does. And most currently due to us.
Just a quick question. I mean, I'm going to be a nerd here because I've got you on, in my show, and there's some nerd things I want to get straightened out because you're a nerd in areas that I'm not a nerd in, and I want to have a certain nerding capacity. And that is, does that capturing, is it capturing photons at infrared frequencies and then retransmitting them at the same roughly infrared frequency? That's what's going on?
The same frequency,
okay,
yes.
so it's not a case of taking an ultraviolet and transmitting. Sorry?
Which is that, yes, it's not capturing, it's more absorbs. It absorbs the radiation at a particular range of frequencies, but it's a narrow range for carbon dioxide, fairly narrow, and then absorbs that radiation and then it re-emits at the same frequency. It doesn't necessarily emit the same amount of radiation because that's a function of the temperature. But yes, it's absorption at one frequency and emission at the same frequency. And it's that emission that, because the emission is both to outer space and back down to the Earth's surface, that means the Earth's surface is warming, increasing at equilibrium with increasing carbon dioxide concentrations. It's
Okay.
a bit like a blanket.
Yeah, that's the simple. I think I'm still muted. That's a simple way to understand it, and that you're given is the more sophisticated explanation of how the blanket actually. What are the fibers of the blanket? And the fibers fundamentally are that very flexible bonds between the carbon and the oxygen atoms, and equally hydrogen and oxygen atoms for water. But the other thing about carbon dioxide is the length of time it'll stay in the atmosphere before it gets reabsorbed. Now, we know we live under falling H2O, so we know how water gets out of the atmosphere. But the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, is that mainly relying on other biological processes to reabsorb it?
Yeah, there's this thing called the carbon cycle. I'm not an expert on it, but it's complicated. Yeah. There are a very wide range of processes, each with their own time scales. So there's very rapid time scales with the interaction with the biosphere, with trees and phytoplankton, where there's inhalation, exhalation. You can see that in the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that goes through this oscillation. That's quite significant just within a single year, just due to the biosphere inhaling and exhaling. But that extends all the way out to the real process is weathering by rocks. And that is where the rocks interact with the carbon dioxide to form, oh goodness, I should know.
Calcium carbonate?
Yeah, that's probably it. Thank you.
Calcium carbonate? Hey, I got one right. Okay.
And that, so the thing is, it's quite remarkable, but it is something like 100,000 years. After 100,000 years, I mean, just see what you're exhaling right now. That added carbon dioxide, so it came from fossil fuels, because we are fossil fuel byproducts through the agricultural system. That added element, carbon dioxide, that you've introduced, about 20% of it, I think, will remain in 100,000 years. It's something remarkable. So effectively, it's up there forever.
Yeah, and that's what we're paying the price of a accumulator that we have ignored. And that's what I like about that chart I showed a short while ago. I've taken the data back to 1400. And in fact, the data, of course, goes back, as you know, to 800,000 years. We've got reliable records of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But over that period that we've been sedentary civilizations, it's been pretty much between 260 and 280. So it is only the period of, it almost coincides with the publication of the Wealth of Nations, when the exponential behavior starts. Okay, so the bottom line, the zero of that exponential, is 279.77. Funnily enough, but of course the takeoff point is literally from 1760 to 1780, and that's when you start seeing, oh, it's rising. Okay, so ludicrous. I mean, we really, it's just ignorance that we have about energy in economics, which has led to ignoring the most important determinant of our capacity to be an advanced civilization, and then also that's the same thing which will destroy the advanced civilization.
Yeah, I think that's really important here, is that we built our complexity, our sophistication, all our culture off of prior consumption of energy. I mean, this goes all the way back to probably the Greeks cutting down trees to create some of the foundations of our civilization, but that's how they were sustained. It wasn't fossil fuels, it was probably through combustion of whatever the trees were that denuded grease. And that's accumulated over time through various sources, including ultimately fossil fuels, as you point out. That's when it was accelerated. But all this has added up to, a civilization today that's just incredibly, enormously complicated. I mean, here I am interacting through a cell phone. That's, it's magic. And all of this must be sustained. It doesn't just simply exist without a continued input of energy. All our continued sophistication, must require an ongoing consumption of energy. And that's not just energy to continue to grow, that's just energy to keep what we have going right now. And if you take away that energy source, we're going to collapse back to a simpler state, perhaps very quickly.
That raises a point which do you know Nate Hagens?
Yes.
Has Nate interviewed you yet on his podcast? Okay, I'm going to arrange that because Nate's podcast is called The Great Simplification. And what he fundamentally argues, we have to drastically simplify the society we have, go backwards to be able to have any sustainable future. And I think that's what you're saying in a sense as well, with a better mathematical foundation for it. That we can't continue building on the Greeks who cut down the olive trees, or cut down what was there before they planted the olive trees, more likely. We simply have to, with that trajectory, leads to total collapse. But what Nate calls a great simplification is just what you're talking about in terms of a decaying system. But if you decay sufficiently, could we get back to the point where, at a much, much lower scale of imposition on the planet, and also, of course, much lower consumption of fossil energy, could you imagine a conceivably sustainable society to go forward?
Yeah, well, I think this is a bit like asking an adult to shrink back to be a baby. It's I guess in some imaginary way, perhaps you could conceive it, but I don't see how the trajectory happens.
I certainly I can't see.
A very, very good question. Is this possible that society could retract to a simpler state without retracting all the way? And my suspicion is no, it can't, because all our society is currently constructed to survive off of a system that has evolved over many thousands of years. And if you were to take away that system that sustains us now, we're just simply not adapted to something that sustains a simpler state. And I mean, humans are very adaptable, but I would guess that. Yeah,
I mean, this is if I can bring up one point, a potential difference between you and me on this point, because we are very, very compatible most of the way through. I agree with you. I think most likely the likely momentum is just to collapse and to fall apart of the whole system. And, we'll end up. We won't need to go to Planet of the Apes. The planet will arrive around us, because the people will continue to try to maintain the pattern of growth that we've had. What people laughably call the elites will want to return to what we've had as the growth trajectory we've experienced for the last quarter millennium, and we'll just fall apart in a heap. But I still think there's the possibility, if we retracted dramatically and we then constrained ourselves, we forced ourselves to live within much, much narrower limits than we currently do, then there would be a potential for a future civilization here. I just hope that's the case, because the greatest fear that I have is not the massive numbers of deaths we're going to experience, because I think that's locked in and nothing we can do about it. It's losing the knowledge we've accumulated in the last quarter millennium. But that's stunning. That's partly what you're talking about with thermodynamics and people talking about nuclear power. And I saw a little piece saying that the James Webb Telescope has spotted water in an asteroid. We lose all that if we lose the structure that we've developed over the last quarter millennium in particular, but certainly over the last 5,000 years. We could lose that knowledge as well and go back to the stage where it's hunter-gathering and where we have the same level of knowledge of the rest of the universe as the other animals do. And in 100 million years or 200 million years' time, Earth will cease being in the Goldilocks zone around the sun, and that'll be it. Everything will be lost. And that's anything I'm trying to avoid happening. It's that particular fate. Whereas I think you're a bit more sanguine and just basically it's going to happen. That's just life, the universe, and everything.
Yeah, I mean, as an academic, of course, I'm acutely aware of yes, what this trajectory implies, and it feels a bit surreal at times. Working very hard to try to contribute to a body of human knowledge that I believe will no longer exist, and perhaps not.
Well, that's one of the reasons I'm
sustained. That all requires energy. I mean, you think about, what is required just to sustain our current knowledge systems, and it's quite a lot. It's a sophisticated
and knowledge, not
sustained by
and knowledge is not. Yeah. And knowledge is just not like, open an encyclopedia and there's knowledge. Knowledge is actually applying things. That's why, again, you and I have spoken a bit about Musk, and my attitude to Musk is a bit complicated. But the fundamental thing he says, which is so true, is there's a big difference between a prototype and a production model. It's very different. The hard thing is making the machine that makes the machine. And if you lose the knowledge by not making the machines anymore, then the knowledge being in a book is just useless. The real knowledge is doing. And if we lose the capacity to do, then we become ignorant. And that's what I think we face unless we manage to get production off planet. And that's why I'm a bit of a space cadet on that front. I'd like to imagine we can, before we destroy the capacity for the planet to support civilization, we get civilization off planet, and then the energy issues and the waste issues that apply here don't apply. Of course, we have a horrific environment which we'd be trying to do that, but that's why I've got my little prayer that we'll get off planet before we destroy the planet. By the way, Dan, just quickly, there have been some great questions turning up here which haven't they got any chance to reply to. What I would like you and Ty to do is take a copy of all those questions, and we'll discuss them next week. We don't have a guest. We don't have a guest network because it's a great set of questions there and comments, which we won't get a chance to get to because Tim and I've monopolized the time. But they're very good questions, very good comments, and I'd like to have a chance to address them.
Maybe we could have a show that we just go through the comments and say, come on back for next week's episode.
I think I'm saying that. I'm saying that right now. That would be a good idea for next week. Tim, before we run out of time here, what are you working on right now? You and I haven't got a chance to work with the time and circumstance, and COVID has separated us for a couple of years now. But what's your current research?
The generator, and I'm building plug cables for doing that. But in my research, a lot of my research right now is trying to study how snowflakes swirl. And it's like a general problem in fluid dynamics, is trying to figure out how particles move in a turbulent flow. And we're doing observations at a ski resort where we track how snowflakes move in a laser light sheet. And then part of what I do, you mentioned machines, a big part of what I do is designing and testing and commercializing new machines we develop. This machine is for measuring precipitation, specifically the mass and density of initial snowflakes. So using measurements of turbulence, tracking the particles, and measuring their mass, their inertial properties, we're trying to figure out the very general problem of how inertial particles, heavy particles, respond to a turbulent flow. And this is a problem that has bedeviled scientists for decades, and I think we're going to make real progress on this.
Fantastic.
Looking at snowflakes.
So why do you call it mass fall speed? Why do you have to use that string? Like what, when you're describing your research?
Sorry, what was that?
The mass fall speed.
The snowflakes have a mass, they have a density, and they fall. And the thing is that they don't fall in still air, they fall in turbulent air. And so their speed of falling is something that, well, if you just look at the snow, as it falls, it gets buffeted by the air currents in a way that has it moving up sometimes, as well as might be even just, a seed from, pollen or whatever. It's from a plant. It moves around in a way that doesn't have it settling down. falling straight down. And that's a very, very, very difficult problem to solve. But we're finding beautiful simplifications statistically in the behavior of snowflakes, in turbulence, that suggests that the problem may end up being fundamentally more simple than complicated. And it's the same things with people too. Is that, we were talking about wars very early on, is that, we're buffeted by the forces of history. Yet whatever the complications are, the deterministic complications are of modeling how people behave, statistically, our behaviors end up being very simple. That's, sort of a guiding principle in my research, is trying to find the system properties that describe a system rather than doing the much more challenging, difficult problem that I'm not smart enough to solve, of looking at things deterministically and trying to figure out how individual forces affect things. I can hard.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'd like to wrap up the show if everybody's okay with that. I want to thank Tim for his time on the show, and Steve for that conversation. It was really nice to see you guys get together and have that conversation. So that's it for Steve and Friends this week. Please tune in next week and like, subscribe, follow. Thanks, guys.
We did it again. Now, as I said, our last show was canceled after you appeared on it, so fingers crossed the executives don't do that again.
The more I read in the neoclassical thing, the more I just, I'm scratching my eyeballs out all the time.
The voice of God in the background.
Oh, geez. Once the coins get warm enough because of your body temperature in the winter, it actually keeps you moderate beer drinking in the evenings. Well, that's inspiring for a Saturday morning.